Hi and welcome to the first program by Parasite this year. A Happy New Year to everybody whom we have not wished Happy New Year yet. But I have the greatest honor today to present a presentation by our dear friend, Clare Butcher, who's our participant at the Parasite International Art Residency. Claire's research proposal here was kind of interesting because we met a few years ago, and I will not bore you with the long story, but to cut it short, she has been researching the second Johannesburg Biennial Trade Routes history and geography for the last 4 years. This is 2014. And part of the Biennale itself consisted of an exhibition called Hong Kong, etc., curated by Hou Hanru. Now, this was the main catcher of bringing Clare here, was the idea of her research looking at this sort of under-documented or not documented Biennale at all. And through the course of the 1 month, she will be talking about her presentation, her previous projects, which include an exhibition that was done 2 years ago at Stevenson's called If a Tree Falls. If a Tree. So, without further ado, let me just introduce Clare. Clare Butcher is from Zimbabwe, is a curator and writer who cooks and eats. That's a very big thing. She currently teaches fine art at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy and is a member of the School of Missing Studies at the Sandburg in Amsterdam. Recently, she conducted an MFA at the Center of Curating the Archive at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, during which she initiated the NX residency program in collaboration with the South African National Gallery. Butcher, Clare also completed the Diapo curatorial program in Amsterdam in 2009, so this is post-Diapo work.
Alumni. Thank you, Ginny. We're just using mics, even though it seems kind of formal and ridiculous, but for recording purposes, apparently it's better. So sorry to cut the intimacy a little bit. But thank you very much to Ginny and to Cosmin and the Parasite crew for being wonderful hosts this month. I'm almost at the end of my stay. And thank you to Asia Art Archive for agreeing to host us tonight, and Michelle especially for your input in this research so far, and I think we're in an amazing location. If I start just staring off over your shoulders, it's because it's a really nice view and I'm not used to being in locations like this. Yes, so basically tonight I just wanted to not bore you completely with quite a long story, and I'm going to break it up into a few parts. And if I talk fast, it's usually just because I get really excited about things or nervous. So just let me know if I'm not making myself clear, and I apologize beforehand if I mispronounce names. And also for any very ignorant comments I might make, because generally this is a point of ignorance from which I am beginning. This is my first time in East Asia. I've never been this far from Africa before, and I found this wonderful image which seemed to kind of sum up all of my feelings about where I currently am and what I know about it. This was in Macau in a small church, and they were actually presenting the journey of Catholicism from Portugal to this part of the world. We are not talking about Catholicism this evening, you'll be glad to know, but in a way it seems to, as I said, kind of sum up exactly what I can and can't say about the place that I find myself in. It is a bit of a hole to me before I arrived here. I had no preconceptions, I had no idea what to expect. I often say to other people that this part of the world is like Africa to other people. They just have no idea what's inside that big set of borders. And so yes, as I said, it's a place of ignorance that I'm definitely starting from, and yet oddly familiar. We talked about the Commonwealth last night and how great it is, because there's actually some really surprising links that can be made with these very disparate parts of the world, where you have in fact the same street names and the same sorts of afternoon tea rituals, and a kind of code of politeness that seems to kind of cross in a very passive-aggressive sort of way, this whole geography. So I have actually found many familiar things here as well, which was quite a surprise. But this evening, as Tini said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research sort of reason that I'm here, but then also framing it within a kind of bigger story of some South African artistic practices. And I want to be quite specific about that, is that I'm not going to give you an overview. I'm a very bad summarizer, so I'm going to be talking quite specifically about things, and that, just so that you know, this is a very idiosyncratic perspective, it's mine, of things that I find interesting, and also possibly names and ideas that you can follow up with, and I would love to give you any notes or anything later. You see over on the table there, as you arrived, we have a little materials table, and these are just some of the things that I've been gathering over the years since I began this journey. So you have one of the original catalogues of the Johannesburg Biennial, the second one, as well as some reviews that were written at the time, of which I've highlighted certain sections that are quite interesting, and then some more specific materials relating to Hong Kong, etc., the show that was curated by Hou Hanru as part of that biennial. So first, we're talking about Johannesburg. So I assume that most of you know where that is located. It's somewhere here. And then we'll zoom in like they do on the news. The biennial itself actually didn't only take place in Johannesburg. It took place in two cities. It was Johannesburg and Cape Town. But as Cape Town is a bit more familiar, I think, to most people, just because of where it's at geographically, and also, I guess, on the kind of global memory in a way. Johannesburg seems a little bit more obscure, perhaps also because it's a much newer city. It only really started up at the beginning of the 1900s as a mining and sort of speculation site. So City of Gold, that's what its nickname is, because that's really what built it. The exhibition basically took place in the downtown heart of it, but then also you see Soweto on your left, as well as Alexandria above the main sort of center of Johannesburg, and those are townships where certain activities of the biennial also took place. Just to give you a kind of sense, because I like maps, and they always give us a false sense of security, I think. But first, something light to start us off, because I know every time we mention that word biennial, this is kind of what goes through my mind.
What is with this guy? Who is he?
The video artist.
What do you do? Huh? It's Sandra that Biennale.
Dimmi Sandra. Sì? Dimmi, dimmelo.
And that's pretty much it. They just sit there and laugh for the next 5 minutes. And that's me, that guy, looking at these people and shaking my head and being like, what's going on? So yes, this was also maybe the common perception by most South Africans, was looking on in utter shock and amazement as their city was infiltrated by the Sandros of biennales, and these, and again, it's called the Johannesburg Biennale, not biennial. So this was a word that people were very unfamiliar with. What the hell is that? And what's a video artist? Why do you just get to sit there? And why are biennials funny? These are all things that were very much a starting point for actually what turned out to be quite a difficult project. It was the second Johannesburg Biennial, and what some of you may have heard when you were coming in was a song by Beyond, which was dedicated to Nelson Mandela many years ago, and you saw a lot of slides of the kind of build-up to his release, and that was in 1994. And the first biennial was actually in 1995, and that was much smaller scale, very local, very much about establishing a kind of national identity within the creative field. So it was very African and very South African. So a lot of community art, a lot of craft, mainly housed within the kind of safe walls of the institutions that did exist. Johannesburg has a very lovely art gallery. We call them galleries, even though it's a museum technically, and they have quite an interesting collection ranging from chairs by Rietveld and photographs by Moholy-Nagy to very odd B-team sort of Renoirs and a lot of also locally collected crafts, as well as some contemporary art. But due to lack of resources, it's not an incredibly established collection up to the present, so it kind of stops at a certain point. And the building itself, though, is really interesting. It was set up also towards the beginning of the 1900s, obviously by wealthy English benefactors, and made up primarily of a sort of English core of work at the time. So this kind of biennial, the one that arrives in 1997, is completely foreign in scale and in media, as well as in the mediation and the kinds of questions that it was hoping to ask. And I think it's important for us to kind of erase a little bit of the sorts of biennial critique that we've become very burdened with, I think, over the last years, because this was not happening within that discussion. This was before that. And this is really one of the first Southern biennials that broke with that pavilion structure, the national pavilion structure, and sought to do something very different. So really site-specific, looking at the city as a thing, in a way that not a lot of other biennials were trying to do at that point. So I think that that's important for us to kind of maybe turn off that button a little bit and choose a certain naivety when looking at some of this, to appreciate it for the attempt that it did make within very difficult circumstances. But then also later on we'll turn the critique back on and say, actually, where has this kind of model come to now? Has it actually changed that much? Or are we still just looping and asking the same questions in a kind of Big Lebowski fashion and just laughing at ourselves? So it was, yes, it opened in October 1997, and then it was actually set to run for a bit longer, but due to circumstances, it was actually partially closed from about Christmas of 1997 onwards, and then only a few of the venues were actually running until about the middle of January, and then it did stop. So it meant that people that had bought their tickets from overseas for a little bit later than that arrived to closed doors. And the organizers were Africa's Institute for Contemporary Art, ICA. They are an organization that no longer exists. This was kind of their crowning shame, this biennial. So members of that group are still very active, but they disbanded and are doing other things in different places. The location, as I said, was Johannesburg and Cape Town in different institutions, as well as more public-centered works and things kind of in informal settings like restaurants and cinemas, etc. The artistic director was Okwi Nwezo, who we know has just been named the artistic director of the next Venice Biennial, so that's quite interesting. And he also went on from this to curate Documenta 11, which was also something that I think he definitely took a lot of the ideas that he had instilled or experimented with in Johannesburg into that format. Interestingly enough, in an interview which you can also read over there, after this biennial, he said, "Oh, I hope to never do another." Well, maybe I should send him that text again, just remind him of what he said. Basically, he also then, instead of having this kind of nationally focused thematic, he invited curators from all over the world, from very different backgrounds, to make shows under this umbrella of history and geography and trade routes. So he actually co-curated with Octavio Zaya Alternating Currents, which was the kind of main venue in downtown Johannesburg. Graft was the South African contingent, where it was a South African curator, Colin Richards, who unfortunately passed away at the end of last year. And that was actually situated in the National Gallery in Cape Town. And I think, for all intents and purposes, is one of the first instances actually of institutional critique that can really be seen within a contemporary South African artistic exhibition history, which is very interesting. But I won't go into that because that's its whole sort of separate story. Life's Little Necessities, which was curated by Kelly Jones, and that was also in Cape Town in the castle. So again, these very loaded contexts in which these things were being presented, and that was all women artists, important and exported. Though some people, there's a bit of discussion as to what the title actually was in the end. So some people just lose the "and," so important, exportant, I think is the more used one, and that was Gerardo Mosquera, who we know from the Havana Biennale. Transversions by Yu Yeon Kim, and from Korea, and that was next to Hou Hanru's exhibition in downtown, in the downtown precinct also, and his show was Hong Kong, etc. They also had a film program of Africa and African diasporic filmmakers, and that was in various locations around Johannesburg, supposedly. So again, we have all of these kinds of pre-opening desires and wishes being communicated, and a lot of press going around what it was going to be. And then you have the kind of after opening anticlimax where no one could find any of these venues and never knew where the screenings were and what time they would be held, and equipment would fail. And so as to whether much of this happened, there's a big sort of question mark, but it leaves a lot of space for imagination, which is exciting. And then there was also a conference which had the wonderfully fresh title of Towards a Definition of Culture in the Late 20th Century. And that was Olu Ogwibe, who we also know, and he's kind of Okwe and Wezor's kind of, they have a tense relationship, but are both kind of, they grew up in a way in the same sort of vein, out of West Africa, going to the States as young art historians and really making a name for themselves. So they're both highly respected within their field and extremely educated men. So Olu was put in charge of the kind of discursive element, and actually, unlike most of the rest of the biennial's online presence, you can still actually see Olu Ogwibe's record of that conference online. So yeah, it's got a completely unrelated URL, so it would be very difficult to find, but if you just typed in Olu Ogwibe, Second Johannesburg Biennial, you would find this, and actually it's a really good record. It has all the themes about all the presenters, papers that you can download in this really beautiful 90s website design with a GIF. At that conference, some really interesting things went down, which I also won't go into because it's a little bit of a side issue. But basically, there was a lot of discussion there about exactly how fresh was this really. So that's, in a sense, where the buttons got turned on in terms of, okay, you can... as Nwezor was challenging the structure of Biennial, was he really doing it sincerely? Was he really challenging the content and the makeup, the constituency of what was going into that Biennial in terms of participants, in terms of representation? How South African was it really? Or could it actually just have taken place anywhere? Was he using South Africa as a metaphor rather than as an actual site, as a location to be working within? And then also issues around the role of mostly black South African women, because they were highly underrepresented within the Biennial. But that also speaks of artistic education and access to those kinds of levels of visibility within a contemporary art sphere in South Africa at that moment, and I think still actually not much has transformed. So that's something, if you are interested in, I'm kind of glossing right now because I'm trying to get to the Hong Kong etc. bit. But that's an area of interest, and there's a publication called Grey Matters that came out of that particular debate, in which Okwe Nwezor was really taken to task by a lot of women within the contemporary art field at that time with these sorts of questions. There were, however, and this is again a question mark, whether this is the actual number, 160 participating artists. No one can really confirm this, the numbers change with each report, but they were apparently from 32 different countries, and at that time that was also highly exceptional in terms of just visa requirements and access to various traveling modes, especially within Africa at that moment, were not easy, and they still aren't. So this was also kind of taking into account the trade routes, the contemporary trade routes, not only the historical ones, of people having access to places and being able to move, and artworks moving. And we'll also discuss that in a little bit, the problems that emerged. So zooming in further, we have a map of downtown Johannesburg, and this is a contemporary map. So it's important to note, okay, so this is Newtown, where the sort of main site of the biennial was. This bridge didn't exist, so the Mandela Bridge. So basically, this railway line basically cut off the city quite successfully, where you had to cross Queen Elizabeth Road to get into the downtown, the really dodgy neighborhoods. So the fact that they situated it there is really significant because it was a place that not a lot of white South Africans would have gone for a very long time. Or very long, at least the end of the 80s and the early 90s were an incredibly violent period in South African history, kind of the peak of the end of apartheid, and then also the kind of pre-establishment of a government with a kind of rule of law that could actually quell violence, especially within the downtown areas. So a lot of people just would steer clear, and not only whites, I think, but anyone that could help it would steer clear of that neighborhood. However, you see that the Johannesburg Art Gallery is situated right in the heart of that. So that's the Joubert Park, which still has quite a reputation, but is much more accessible now. But you see the central railway station is there, and that's also really interesting and very important because it means that people who needed to take trains could access those kinds of spaces. They weren't using cars, because we're talking about a very car-heavy country here. This is not a place where if you don't have to use public transport, you don't. So this is, and also at that time in questions of safety. So I also want to frame this as a part of the 90s and that things have changed a lot and substantially since then. But we're talking about early 90s and moments of a very early democracy. So there's this fear and segregation which still weighs very heavily upon the city. In addition to that, you have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, which are going on around here. So it's literally blocks from where this spectacular contemporary art moment is taking place. And it's at the same time. So I think that that's a really important set of coordinates to bear in mind if one thinks about what is emerging out of the questions that these artists are asking, and just the idea of having this huge biennial, and then the very nitty-gritty reality of what's being played out as a kind of national theatre just streets away. So I think hopefully that kind of gives you an idea. Some of the biennial happened sort of in that direction, and then others were, as you saw, Soweto, which is down there, and those would have been accessible by train, also buses, etc. So there is the capacity for foot traffic around this, but the fact is that not much of that happened. So this primary audience, which this biennial was really intended for, there was no art audience within that location, and people had to come from outside, but they didn't want to come from outside because there was this very infamous sort of reputation lingering around these sorts of spaces. So I think that that's really important to think about within the politics of the city itself, and this calling itself a city exhibition, particularly in relation to Hou Hanru's proposition of linking Hong Kong with Johannesburg, which I think were actually at very different points of their lifespans at that moment. I'm going to show you a few works just from some of the various locations, just so you have a bit of an overview. So you had really big names like Hans Hacker, showing a piece that he'd actually done in sort of 3 iterations prior to that. It's called The Vindication of Dulcie September, and this was the name of a South African representative to France that was assassinated in 1988. And he'd shown it in 3 parts before. So the first flag you see is the ANC there. The second is actually an old apartheid flag that was ripped in 2 and then tied again. And then the third is the new Republic of South Africa flag that was then inaugurated in 1994. So this is kind of the culmination of that series, and thus the vindication of her memory in a sense, and not. So it's a kind of problematizing of all of these memories kind of being commemorated at the same time, in a sense. You also had a work by Coco Fusco, and this was in reference to the notorious pass books that had dominated so much of apartheid South African life, where if you were a non-white, you were legally required to carry a pass book around you, with you at all times that had all of your papers about where you lived, what you did, who you were married to, where you were allowed to be. So basically a visa to be in your own city. And to traverse all of these borders that one had to on a daily basis between townships and the places that you worked. And so she kind of re-inscribed this into the logic of the biennial, where everyone that went into the main venue, the electric workshop, which we saw just behind Hans Hake's work before, everyone had to pay 5 rand for this book, get their photograph taken, and then carry this book at all times. And of course, it completely bottlenecked that entrance. It meant that people had to wait for hours to get in, and that was the point. In fact, that you would be checked, that you had to go through this incredibly inconvenient surveillance in order to be able to see this art that you weren't even really sure you wanted to see in the first place. And apparently it was always the South African whites that were complaining the loudest about this, because they, of course, never had to become patient or develop those tools within this kind of structure. That sounds kind of reductive, but apparently it was very true, and I'm sure a lot of the international visitors were perplexed, but they probably went along with it like, Biennale. Anyway, next to it, you see, because this reference book belongs to a good friend of mine, Christian Riff, who is an artist that was also unofficially involved with the biennial. So there were a number of local artists that really kind of took the moment, took the opportunity to say, okay, there's this incredible audience that's coming, the likes of which we're probably never going to see again, and they were right, because it never happened again. And they made a kind of a fringe festival around the biennial. And then also unsolicited interventions within the works themselves. So he had a campaign called No Copyright, and sorry, I should say no copyright on the title there, where he then would go around sticking this small sticker on various works. And again, it was this challenge to the international art world of always, of frequently accusing the colonies of derivative work, always looking towards the center and then making a kind of copy of what was considered cutting edge. And this was them saying, actually, no, this time we are the cutting edge, and that in fact all of these ideas, if we're to take this biennial seriously, are global and shared. So let's cut the crap basically and start talking about where we are now. This is a very interesting work because it really was one of the few to actually connect not only in an aesthetic sense, as I would say Coco Fusco's performance sort of did, but in a very difficult way, because he is a white South African man, Andries Botha, who was referring to the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that were happening at that moment. And it's a very different way of him, for him to work within this piece, and it's called Home. And it was just a little Wendy house that was stationed outside the main venue. And you see the buildings of Johannesburg behind. The train line that we saw on the map would be located just behind there, and the kind of central station in that direction. And again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is just a few blocks to the right. And you see, this is quite an emotive photograph that's been taken because it's a domestic worker. She's dressed as someone that would clean houses. So again, it's kind of reminding us that actually not everything has changed with the new democracy, etc. And this kind of Wendy house that's being built is in fact one that security guards would often be stationed in on the edges of certain neighborhoods with this kind of lack of security that a lot of people were feeling, this kind of paranoia. Neighborhoods would gather together and actually pay private security companies. So outsourcing, in a way, the municipality's job of protecting citizens and taking control of that themselves. So in a way, he's again referencing this sense of paranoia that's just pervading everything within that context. And inside, despite the pretty picket fence, and the kind of coziness of the exterior appearance. You go inside and it was completely chilled by air conditioning units. So very, very cold interior, and lining the walls with steel panels inscribed with the testimonies of people that were speaking out in the Truth and Reconciliation hearings just blocks away. So it's incredibly immediate as a reflection and very hard-hitting, I would say. Again, a kind of point of contemporary South African work that's maybe not considered so nuanced, perhaps by people who have had an established history, perhaps in conceptual art. South Africa didn't have that. There were people working in those veins, but not in an established or recognized kind of way. So this is again coming to terms with an international biennial language of installation and sort of using new technology, i.e. air conditioning units, to in a way speak to an audience that actually didn't understand the complexity of what was going on around them, and to make that very physical connection also by positioning himself outside of the main biennial venue. He was also saying, you don't have to get that passbook, you don't have to pay the entrance fee, you can just see this work. And because of that, he got screwed over, and the day after the opening, all the air conditioning units were stolen, and the work was closed. So it's really interesting how the city constantly bites back at this attempt to engage with it, and yet that attempt is certainly not wasted. So it's because of those moments of clash and collision that actually it established something really interesting that I think that we would be foolish to ignore or laugh at or hang our heads in shame, which is actually what the legacy of the biennial has done to most people within the contemporary South African art world. It is this kind of blind spot, this dark hole that we don't actually want to think about because it was this international embarrassment, supposedly. It meant also the beginning of a number of careers. This is Yinka Shonebare's, the Victorian philanthropist's parlor, and one of the first times that he's really branching out into quite an established installation language, using his classic West African prints. And I'm sure that many of you have seen this work in various locations subsequently, and actually Yinka Shonebare has or had an exhibition in Hong Kong recently. And so all of this is establishing new trade routes, in a sense, new lines of flight between the South or the West and these kinds of major metropolitan centers. And yeah, so again, it's kind of, this is the first iteration of something that we've seen recycled many times. So that's also interesting, I think, to think about. And then bringing us closer to home, Wang Yongping. This is one of the first presentations of his Doomsday installation, which I know, again, has been another thing that's been recycled, and I use that word on purpose because that's what it's also about, is wastage and surplus and excessive production in the context of craftsmanship and a locale with a certain tradition and this kind of globalization or the impending doom of globalization. This photograph is not an installation shot from the Johannesburg Biennial. So that's also very important to note, is that most of these photographs are not installation shots because it's incredibly, as Chinyi mentioned, underdocumented. There is a documentary that was made by the National Broadcasting Service in South Africa that was actually played for general television viewers at the time, and that's a wonderful document which I will be sending a copy of to the Asia Art Archive so that you can watch it. It's actually really fascinating, and in there that's actually one of the only instances that you can really see room views of how things were actually set up in relation to each other, and also the interior of a lot of these venues. The electric workshop where this was stationed no longer exists. So again, you have this kind of flattening of that history or erasure, which again we have to kind of restore through speculation and imagination, which is actually perfectly appropriate for the city of Johannesburg, I think. A slight aside, once more. So we get to, oh no, I didn't open the link. Okay, we'll just have that one there. I think you probably all know this scene from The King and I, where he's giving her the what for in terms of how she should act in this new society that she doesn't know the rules of. And he says, when I say sit, you sit. When I say bow, you bow, etc., etc., etc. And that brings us to Hong Kong, etc. And also all of my Hollywoodized preconceptions about this part of the world. So the main exhibition venue was in the Rembrandt van Rijn Gallery, and that was actually a kind of passage space, two passage spaces between the Market Theatre, which is an incredibly important site, also in that downtown area of Johannesburg, which during apartheid was one of the few places that actually protest or resistance theatre was being played out. Also, sort of multiracial spaces where actually casts of white and black actors could be together, making sort of political statements through creative work. So it's an incredibly important location for that. And I find, and the gallery itself also had a history in that it was run by a group of South African artists, so self-organized artist space, that had also had that kind of reputation in the days of apartheid. They were also open to non-white artists showing there, and also encouraged sort of cultural meeting points between practitioners, and were also very vocal about their anti-apartheid sentiments. I don't know how much that manifests in the work itself. The practitioners who ran it, one of them, Stephen Hobbs, is now very much a member of the quite mainstream creative industry, I would call it. So works very much on this kind of edge of urban design and contemporary art. But as a sort of studier of the city, he's one of the very sort of established sort of voices in that field. And I think that this physical structure of the passageway is really important within this context of trying to create some kind of conduit, a liminal zone, if I can use that awful term, between these two places that really didn't have a dialogue with each other, Hong Kong and Johannesburg. And of course, this is an incredibly important year for Hong Kong in which this happens, 1997. This is only a few months after the Great Handover. And this is something that I've been trying to come to terms with a lot since arriving here, what that actually meant for Hong Kong, and how I could understand that as a Zimbabwean South African who saw the end of a colonial period a lot longer ago than here. And what are the ways in which my contemporaries are dealing with that history versus here, and not necessarily versus, or how could these possibly find a dialogue, or how is there even a shared understanding of that kind of legacy, and the strategies or tactics that are being employed to deal with it. How do we make sense of that kind of thing to ourselves, and its continuing legacy? These residues haven't gone. They're all still there. The road names are still there. They're the same. I have a Connaught Road as well in Harare. And yeah, I mean, it's an incredible link. But in the daily lived reality of things, is that actually, are there these sort of similar paths? And I'm not actually sure there are. And but we will get to that in a moment. So in this kind of main passage venue, you see a couple of the names that were involved. Not so many Hong Kong representatives, which is quite interesting. So Ellen Powell we met with yesterday, and she actually wasn't even able to go to Johannesburg to install the work herself. And there's an interesting story around that, which I will get to. Then in Hou Hanru's writing around it, again, because the catalogue was produced before the exhibition, one doesn't actually know whether it bears any truth in what was actually put up in the end. So you have the catalogue's version of the story, and then you have the curator's version of the story, and then the reviews. And so I'm trying to make sense of what actually happened in between, as well as the artist's sort of report. So he also claims that the work of Keith Piper and Bengmengwe was part of his show, and yet apparently it wasn't. It was part of Transversions, which was another show, but because they were both on the same site, basically, it got kind of confusing. So Bisi Silva, who's a very respected art critic from Nigeria, she said no, actually it was from Transversions, and that the Transversions show did a similar thing to Hong Kong, etc., but much more successfully. Because it looked at much closer case studies. It wasn't so broad as Hou Hanru was trying to make it, or so abstractly and quite metaphorical in terms of what it was that he was actually signifying when he said Hong Kong and etc. What did that actually mean? And then big question marks was that 50% of the exhibition was actually meant to be online, and that website no longer exists. So this is also a real sticking point because, of course, you're putting something online for a city where no one owns computers or has internet. This was one of the biggest critiques by the South African art audience of seeing these hotshot curators arriving with their laptops and cell phones. This was a really big thing. This wasn't usual to have, and we were still on that kind of dial-up. You remember that? They go bing, bing, bing. And then finally you would connect. The kind of sound of happiness when you were connected to the World Wide Web. So this wasn't a normal thing, especially to have a virtual project. And the way that Hou Hanru spoke about it was really looking at global cities. And he listed Johannesburg as one of those. And he said, you know, it's this virtual space which actually traverses those borders much fluidly than anything else. And that is a free space. And it's really interesting to think how he was positing that online world as being a democratic one, when in fact we are sitting here now and know the fear with which we kind of log on to something and allow it to see our location. And it's a really interesting progression or regression, perhaps, that's happened so rapidly. Only 15 years later, we're in a very different sort of position. And yet, even at the time, it's an incredibly segregated space because, of course, barely anyone had access to that 50% of his project. And he also spoke about it as being something that would be ongoing, would have multiple contributions and an ongoing discussion, all of these promises that curators make to ourselves about exhibitions and how they're going to progress. None of that really happened. And yet you see some very interesting names. And so I would love to know what these people actually put on there. So I will be meeting with Oscar Hou Hanru on Friday to see if he has a version of this text, and he can tell me what his thoughts were about it. But really, at the core of things, you're talking about infrastructures and mismatching of infrastructures. And I think if Hou Hanru had taken that as the starting point, actually, of his inquiry, it could have been a much more successful question that he put to his audience, rather than kind of glossing over the differences, the very stark and real concrete differences that existed between these two places at the time, and I think still. Also promised were occasional interventions in certain public venues, and these were kind of posited as a kind of network of video pieces that would kind of interlace the city space. So it would be presented in Soweto and Alexandra, which I mentioned already. A couple South African artists on that list, and he also uses this word "and so on" in his interviews, like he can't even remember who else was on that list. But he had a lot of people on his mind, I can imagine that. But I picked up on that because of this etc. part of that title, and how important actually conceptually that fragment, those three little letters, is. An interesting kind of anecdote that he does tell, however, is walking into a bar, a little coffee place in Westbury, which is just to the left of that map that we saw, in which Jan, who would be obviously an Afrikaans speaker, Dutch, South African Dutch, started speaking Cantonese to him when he realized where he was from. And this guy had never left Johannesburg in his life. So it also then signals a kind of moment of hope for that story of the Hong Kong-Johannesburg connection. Of actually, it was despite everything that this curator or that this structure was trying to do in terms of linking these trade routes again, that in fact it was about the completely uncontrolled, informal associations that would be made despite yourself, away from all of the conceptual, very sophisticated artwork that was being made. It was about those personal encounters, in fact, that it was staging. And I think that is really what became the most important element of this entire project, was it was about people meeting people. And these different perspectives clashing against each other in productive and quite aggressive ways at times. Some works from that show, again, not as high-tech as it sounds. So there's a lot of photography and sculpture. And this is Arnie Haraldson, sorry you can't really see the titles very well, from Iceland and Canada. And again, a kind of suburban setting, looking at living conditions, the way that people situate themselves in different parts of the world. Quite basic, but also interesting pieces, but very quiet. And not this kind of new media stuff that, in a way, the fear surrounding that show kind of predicted. This is a very interesting piece by a guy called Kinyele from Zaire in the catalog, which is of course now the Democratic Republic of Congo. So again, nations have changed since this moment. And it's called Swiss Air. And basically he started making models in the 1990s out of cardboard and became just this aficionado of what he called, I think, architectural modelization. And he came up with a whole theory about this, and then began to build entire imaginary cities out of these model cardboard sort of boxes, I guess. And he would often give them very generic names, sort of also indicating a kind of location to them, but one that was also quite global. So you would have a sense of a place, but also this global floating identity, in a way, I suppose, that Hong Kong also does to many people in a kind of collective imagination, I would guess. So also from the DRC, interesting to make that kind of connection. This was a work by Riff, who's from Israel but has a very interesting, quite diplomatic past. She was actually born, I think, in Nepal to Polish parents. And her work is always photographs taken out of fast-moving modes of transport, so trains or planes or cars. And this is called Memory in Real Time. And that's quite an interesting title for the piece, and in the context of our sort of interrogation is what does it mean to have memory in real time when there is no moment of reflection and there's no kind of coordinates to grasp onto in terms of making sense of the present. And that's really what comes, I think, to signify the show, is that it's very now. It's very concerned with this kind of presentism, this moment of who are we, what is the contemporary. It's not very historically located, even though each of the works does kind of link to a something, to an idea. It's not made as explicit as the rest of the biennial, where it was very loaded in history. So again, this kind of location of the passageway is also really important because of that. It's trying to make this transition in a way out of the mire of history and geography and trade routes into this question of these big G words of globalism, globalization. Where is this going? What is going to happen? And that was a very key moment for those ideas. This is a work that probably some of you have seen in a number of iterations, is by Zhu Jia. And it's a work that he started in Beijing, where he attached a camera to the wheel of his bicycle and would ride around the city. And eventually, I think it grew to sort of a 12-channel installation. But here you see it in a very modest form on just one screen, and basically showing the transition of the city also, that fewer and fewer people were riding bicycles, just by virtue of that, but then also what did that notion of revolution mean within that context and changing times. Also that this is not so long after Tiananmen Square, so I think that link is important, but I don't know how obvious that was to people within the Johannesburg context. Also, that video art is quite an important aspect of this biennial, where it really was video art heavy, so much so that they invested in incredible projectors and beaming apparatus, but no one could find an electronic drill anywhere to put a picture up. So this is also quite interesting to see this massive swing towards a very new media technology in sort of defiance of a kind of more outdated discipline like painting. So you see actually very little painting within this show. It's mostly installation and digital art in a way that was also completely out of sync with the context of Johannesburg and what the technical teams there could actually offer and produce. Akwi says at one point in an interview that he's just never seen so many technical disasters in his life, but somehow the show went up, and for him that was the most monumental achievement. In a way that's quite patronizing, but also just that he brought it on himself, I would say, and that if one knows, or if one bothers to do that research into a kind of location, if one just sees what the institutions of a place are producing, surely one can get a sense of how difficult an endeavor of this kind is going to be, and what are the appropriate materials to be using within a kind of context. And that word of appropriateness doesn't seem to come in anywhere, especially like the the millions of trees that were chopped down for this giant catalogue, and the fact that no one really could afford it, and there were so many surplus copies left over, and no one knows where they went or what to do with them. So it's just this kind of, it's this out of sync sort of scale mismatch between things, of having these very grand ambitions, but actually missing a lot of the more subtle moments or things that could have been achieved by small gestures, which actually probably could have been more successful if we were to measure it in those terms. This is a kind of post-review by a local art journal called Artthrob. This is written in November, so that it opened in October. They say, given that this space, with its disparate and distracting elements, is not an easy one to work with, Hou Hanru's show still did not seem to have the coherence one would have liked to have seen. Don't really know what that means, but anyway. Perhaps the global statement in which the shifting position of Hong Kong was taken as a metaphor for contemporary culture was too big a theme for the space, so this tiny little passageway. And a sharper, more narrowly focused approach would have been more effective. Nonetheless, there are some interesting contributions, and the show should be visited, so we all know what that means in art speak. Interesting. This is BZ Silva, again writing for ArtNet in April of '98, so this is after the biennial has closed and she's had a bit more time to reflect. Increasingly advanced technology has become an integral part of big exhibitions. Hong Kong, etc., assembled by the Paris-based Chinese curator Hou Hanru, includes a 110-page website of text, artist projects, and contributions by the likes of Rem Koolhaas and Saskia Sassen. Unfortunately, accessing the site proved to be a tedious and time-consuming undertaking. The show's real-world manifestation, and I kind of like that term, was at the Rembrandt Gallery, a generally uninspired installation of works by Andreas Gursky, Huang Yongping, Ellen Pao, and Fiona Tan. Andreas Gursky's work by, as a matter of interest, which you can see in the catalogue, I've put a post-it at the page, is actually photographs from this neighborhood. So that's also very interesting, just again to kind of time travel us into the now, is that, in fact, it also shows a very different side of this neighborhood under construction. So again, linking very much physically this kind of real-world manifestation that would have been possible, in a sense, if you'd driven that point home. Another real-world issue was in the work of Ellen Pao. This is my beautiful artwork on the side here. This is my sketch, my notes taken from this conversation with her, in which she described the work that she thinks was sent to Johannesburg. It was called Drain Number 4, and she was working with this idea of drain, apparently, in various manifestations. Again, Ellen is also not blameless here in that her own documentation of her work online is frightening, and so she needs to get on top of that as well. But basically it was 2 monitors in a really large box that had been produced while she was on a residency in Brisbane, yeah, that same year. And it was such a large work that actually she hadn't transported it back to Hong Kong yet. And so she'd made the proposal to Hou Hanru, it's there, so why don't you just get them to pack it and send it over? Sneaky. Anyway, but the work was also on a motor that is used normally for stage performances and rotating stages. So it was a really powerful thing that would turn this giant box on its head in the style of an hourglass. And she had recorded, she'd made a kind of plastic glass casement with sand in it and rotated the camera lens at the same pace as the sand box was also rotating. So you have this kind of double rotation of the image and the sand moving like it would in an hourglass, but of course the sand would never actually go anywhere. So you had this double monitor display, but the sand would never leave either monitor into the other one. There was this kind of disconnect, and I think that that's quite a beautiful idea. But is completely different to how Hou Hanru described it in a text where he says installations by Huang Yongping and Ellen Pao in completely different ways deal directly with the historical moment of Hong Kong's transition. I'm not sure what she would think of that either. I didn't show her the text. But in fact, she never had any technical questions from the team on the ground in Johannesburg. And she was like, it's kind of a difficult piece to install, so I'm really amazed they just managed without me. My theory is that it never even got there and they just politely decided to keep her in the dark about it, but or that it was just standing on a plinth and no one ever made it move, which would be classic. And the sad part of that story is that she's never gotten it back. So it's also lingering somewhere in a storage space in Johannesburg. I would have to assume if it ever got there, because I don't think anyone could have afforded to move it anywhere else. So I understand that you also in Hong Kong have had, or not necessarily in Hong Kong, but in the region have had some scandal around some missing artworks that were never returned from a certain biennial. And I think that this is interesting again in the kind of out of sync rhythms of things and these grand ambitions that overstretch actually our capabilities. But again, it's these kind of Icarus-like attempts to reach the sun, and we go plummeting into the sea, but we do it constantly on these kind of flimsy feather wings, which I think is still important, that the attempt gets made. And yet, of course, there is this collateral damage which is real and it is serious, but is nonetheless very interesting for the job of art historians. Which kind of takes us, I guess, into the future. Of course, the biennial was very sadly closed. They were at a deficit of millions of rand. That would also then equate to millions of Hong Kong dollars. But of course, Johannesburg as a city is not as wealthy as Hong Kong as a city. And the excuse was used to actually close the show because it would save them 6.7 million rand a day. Because viewer numbers were not substantial enough to warrant keeping these venues open. So there was a lot of lobbying from various contributors to the show, and they actually managed to raise money by a number of just generous supporters to actually keep these limited number of venues that I mentioned earlier open. So the show was diminished and also cut shorter, but it wasn't just cut, as a lot of the rumors that you might hear subsequently or have heard before, that it didn't just close. There was a kind of discussion, but it then kind of opened again in a very moderated sort of shape. And I think that that's kind of an interesting thing also, that biennials are famous for just kind of ending after the opening. No one actually pays attention to them after that point because it is this kind of zenith and then it just must run itself. And it's interesting to see that there was this level of commitment that was then required just to keep this thing alive. And that's a really beautiful endeavor, this kind of level of curatorial commitment. I don't know if it was shown by the curators themselves, but at least the staff and the team and the infrastructure of that biennial had to keep it going. And Bongi Ndlomu, who was the head of Africus, the biennial organization, she can tell some great stories about how all of that had to happen. She's a cultural activist in South Africa and still very vocal. And I was fortunate enough to have a discussion with her, and that will be kind of the next phase, actually, of the research, is going more into her archive on a structural level around what went wrong. In any case, in '99, people were asking, do we attempt this again? And they consulted a number of specialists, and one of them was Colin Richards, who had curated the Graft show, which was seen actually as one of the most successful parts of the biennial, primarily because it related so directly with what was happening now, because it was contemporary South African artists, but also because of the strategies he chose were very modest, were very moderate, even though they were quite radical. And I like it just sounds exactly like him, so I'm just going to read it out. Well, I can't really speak for the international art world. Only God and probably creative directors can do this. Nudge, nudge, Akwi. I do think there remains an under-articulated disjunction between the eyes of the international art world and eyes from within our borders. The last Biennale, for example, dramatized this disjunction. Neither the South African art world nor the international art world is, of course, without its own internal contradictions and tensions. So it is difficult to generalize with any confidence. But I think it's important that what the Biennales offered is not lost. I would speculate that it would have been important in global terms to continue this initiative in a biennial format, i.e. a third Johannesburg Biennale. But this is not realistic, or perhaps even appropriate in local terms. There should be, and doubtless are, other formats in which we can explore our internal cultural worlds as they intersect with the global traffic in culture. I also think we need time to build local culture more effectively, though this should not be done exclusively or defensively. This does not mean rejecting anything external or declaring some improbable moratorium on the dynamic interplay of the local and the global. Still, not an easy question. So in a way, he says nothing and everything within that. He's excellent at getting around things very diplomatically. But I think he raises some really key issues that I felt resounding here in my time that I've been here. This kind of island status, in a way that South Africa was regarding itself as, because of the outcomes of the cultural boycotts of the 1980s, which I showed you a clip at the very beginning. The video clip was Artists Against Apartheid. The American music scene had made a response to the fact that Frank Sinatra had come and performed in South Africa in the 1980s, breaking the cultural boycott. In a sense, that was where contemporary art was at. It was wounded because of the silence that it had to exist in, and this lack of exchange, other than through exile, that it had to operate within for a very long time. And those effects were still being felt. And so what Richard's here is kind of warning against is don't return to that kind of parochialness because you feel wounded by what's happened with this biennial, or because you feel that this disjunct is insurmountable. And I feel like in the conversations that I've been having here, though it's much more of a transitional space, there still seems to be a disjunct between how Hong Kong perceives itself, and then also, sorry, this cuts out occasionally, how people actually see it, or what its possible sort of approaches to it are outside that. And this kind of moves us, I think, into the space of the archive, and that's kind of where I'm getting to, is what do we do with all of this hurt and shame and guilt, which are all very South African emotions, in a positively constructive way, using the lapses, the gaps, the holes, the things that we have to just fill with imagination. And in a city that was built by mining, that seems really appropriate. It's been kind of extracted, and now what do we do with what remains? And in an interview that I would really recommend with Carol Becker, who then wrote a book subsequently, in Wezo says, in the South African context, soliciting answers from the archive is akin to talking to ghosts in a space haunted by specters of violence and human violation. What memories does the archive possess, and what knowledge does it yield when prodded? And when memory and knowledge are unyielding to this prodding, it becomes necessary to invent new stories and intentions, which is what is happening at the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. In a sense, it is quite perverse, because that ability to reinvent a different past seems to be what South Africa is using to shape its future. And we were having a small discussion before about the role of fiction within this overcoming of a certain colonial problem or baggage. And in this case, an apartheid baggage. And what are these new stories and intentions that are being used to fill those holes? And then how sincere are those stories, in fact? And when do they kind of move out of the space of relevance, of not being real world and manifestation-ish enough, manifest enough? And when do they kind of move into the realm of nostalgia or romanticism? And it's this incredibly fine line, I think, between those things, and that's definitely something where I think South Africa is positioned now. There's a lot of young South Africans that have grown up in a kind of post-apartheid era that don't remember what that was like, that don't remember the first day that they had a black girl or a white girl arrive at their school. And in this moment of kind of political fatigue, how do we deal with this very heavy history in a way that is light, that is accessible, that is still enjoyable, that's still aesthetic, that still can be compelling and beautiful and wonderful, while still doing justice to the heaviness or the weightiness of that content and that context and where it's coming from. So kind of you've got denial on the one side, and then you've got this kind of the magic on the other, and what do we do between those two things? And I think that, in a way, many see that as the space of the archive. And this is a shot from a project that then I finally got to in 2012 in Johannesburg. It was part of a 3-part revisiting of trade routes that was initiated by actually a commercial gallery in South Africa, which again is kind of an infrastructural symptom, is that public institutions don't have the resources to stage these kinds of research projects. And so a lot of commercial galleries have actually been the leading voices in bringing people over, even that they don't represent, and they don't do it for money because the market is so small in South Africa anyway. But it really is about taking a kind of leading role in establishing a discussion around contemporary art and exposing the public to different kinds of practices. And so I had a conversation with one of the younger gallerists a number of years before, where I had been at a symposium, actually Former West, organized in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I'd been sitting next to a South African artist, and we'd heard Akwi talk in quite abstract terms about the biennial. He wasn't very emotional, or maybe he was masking that. And he had, and this artist had turned to me and he just said, actually, whatever he says, that was the first time I really knew what art could actually be, was seeing that show, and that was why I became an artist, because of that biennial. Because it was completely different to what I was seeing in school. And it was a really simple comment, kind of cute, but in fact it really got me thinking about, okay, what were the ripple effects of this catastrophic moment, this complete failure, and what would that actually mean now? And with the dearth of documentation and the fact that we have to just speculate and fill in with our imaginations all of these things that happened, what are the productive links that we could actually form by reflecting back on it and actually claiming that archive and establishing or instantiating an archive of this biennial that didn't actually exist? And fortunately, a lot of people have kept personal archives. So one of them, for Graft, Colin Richards, gifted me his entire personal archive and just said, what did he say? Use your discretion, whatever that means. So I did, and that was my discretion. I don't know if it was very discreet, but I started working through personal correspondence with these artists, the new works that were commissioned, the budgets that were shared, the kinds of conversations that were happening with the biennial organization, with Akwi, all happening on faxes, of course, because that was the moment of the fax. And all of these things had been carefully preserved. But of course there was a ton that just there wasn't the space and time to deal with. So this was definitely just the first step, was in sort of midway through 2012. And I called it If a Tree, ... was the name of the project, as you see below, because it was based on this kind of philosophical dilemma of if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. And it's about this problem of witnessing history or not, and filling in the ... the etc. That, can be completely full or completely empty in some cases. And this is some collected materials. So you see the giant catalogue, one of the artist passes, the short guide that was produced with it, and the kind of general sort of biennial-esque sorts of materials that were produced. And one wonders actually how useful they were, or how closely they actually related to the reality of what was happening on the ground. So I started just working through this material in a project space in Johannesburg as part of a kind of discursive program and this kind of live archival feed. And I decided to fax all of the materials to myself as a way of kind of not preserving them, because of course this carbon copy paper fades in the sun, so it's the completely useless way of actually copying something. But that was also the point, is that we could never really reconstruct actually this moment of what had happened. So how could we create actually something new? So yes, and also gain an understanding also of the length of time and the amount of labor actually that went into this mammoth project. Also, facsimile has a wonderful meaning of making something similar but at a distance. So there is a kind of loss of information along that stretch, and I find that is also an incredibly poetic idea in relation to this revisiting of exhibitions, the writing of exhibition histories. There's something that we can never recapture, and that is actually the space of art. That is where the art happens, is in this moment of inexplicability, or where we don't have fancy words anymore. This is Bongi Ndlomu, who was the head of Africus, wrapped up in the original biennial banner. Very dramatic, she's an incrediable figure. And this was a discussion that we had called Biennial Necessities After the Bible and W.B. Yeats. And this was taken from Thabo Mbeki's statement in the catalogue that you can actually read when he was still the vice president under Mandela at the time. Interestingly, none of the government were represented within the biennial openings or ceremonies. So there was none of this kind of acknowledgement of that moment by political structure, which is very interesting, again, to kind of see this complete mismatch between what was the priority, what was the urgency of that moment, and did we really need a biennial? And that was really the question that we were sort of posing within this discussion, was, are they even necessary or appropriate, as Richards had asked at that point. And alongside that was the more kind of official exhibition project. So I was kind of doing these two things at the same time of working through the archive, but also commissioning artists to themselves look at their connection with the biennial. So what happened in the space of the gallery was that none of those artists that were participating in that show had actually been artists in the original show, but they were all connected to it somehow. So one of them was actually a tour guide. One of them was a technician. One of them was a curator, Colin Richards, who did graft. Another was this student who I mentioned, who had gone to see it and had decided then to become an artist. Others were people that had just kind of heard about it, that knew that it was this really famous moment, that had no connection other than that they knew someone who knew someone that had gone. And here you see Heemin Chong, who I know is a familiar name around here. And I invited him also because, to me, he seems like the biennial artist. He might even watch this, and I know he'll appreciate that comment. But in a way that he has this really wonderfully self-effacing approach to these kinds of structures, where he's completely cynical about them, but he also knows the kind of necessity of taking part within those trade routes. And I'd worked with him before on a project in Amsterdam a little while ago, and I was just interested in posing this question to him of saying, how are you connected with this thing? Do you think that this changed the way that you circulate in the world as an East Asian artist within these very different sorts of spaces? Did that affect your work and your perspective and that circuit for you? And in fact, very amazingly, he had just met Eduardo Cachucho, who was recently in Hong Kong as well, the partner of Matteo Lucchetti, who was the former resident of Parasite. And they had met in Paris, because this is what happens. And Eduardo is a South African from Johannesburg, who specializes in the history of Johannesburg as an architect. And now he's pursuing a career as a fine artist using that background. And they basically came together and then made a proposal to me that they wanted to commission a text by a contemporary South African writer who knew something of that biennial, because they both felt so far away from it, either geographically or temporally, that they just said, look, let's find someone who can at least speculate in some informed way about that show. And we found Sean O'Toole, who's a really wonderful writer who co-edits a great urban journal called Cityscapes. And he wrote a story, A Beautiful Mess, that you can actually access on the website, in which he describes Smokkel, which was the kind of official fringe festival. And Smokkel is a South African neologism for smuggle. And basically, again, in relation to this theme of trade routes, who were the smugglers? Who were the people that were unofficially part of those trade routes, and what were they facilitating alongside through contraband and sort of helter-skelter? This is the website of the project, and you can just see a couple of the names. I brought it up just because I don't want to show you each work individually, but you can see some of the images of the project, where basically each artist produced a new work or kind of revisited an old one in a new way. And also I encourage people to choose things that they hadn't looked at for a long time, because usually this was located more closely in a chronological sense to the biennial and maybe bore some relationship to it. And interestingly, subsequently, since kind of looking at a lot of these pieces, I see more formal links actually with works that did exist in the biennial that I never actually saw before. So even despite ourselves, in a sense, we were completely caught up within that history without even being aware of it, in a sense. And it's wonderful to now be able to archive ourselves and look back and make those connections once again. I'm thinking particularly about this work by Kemang Walehulere, who's a really promising young South African artist, and basically he was the only one that really referred quite directly to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He had a black box which he covered with chalk murals, which he's become quite famous for, and these bones, and old outdated apparatus that could no longer be used. He also then, you can't really see it very well, but he shredded documents of the first democratic constitution that was produced in South Africa. So this room was just full of this shredded paper, which then just became sort of packaging for these bones and objects, and he called it 30 Minutes of Amnesia, which he's sort of developing over his own work. And again, maybe this looks slightly obvious or too explicit in a sense to a non-South African audience, but I think this is quite a new way of working with archival material for us, and quite an exciting one, because it really transposes the objects themselves. It takes very seriously the materiality of these things that we're dealing with, paper and bones and chalk that can be erased, and darkness and obscurity, but also conceptually deals with where are these things coming from, and then how can, by bringing them together, how can we actually reconstitute a kind of story, or actually wrest something from destruction and actually make it something new that will keep it from entering the realm of amnesia, in a sense, by constantly presencing it amongst us in the exhibition as a space. And are there any other works that I want to my favorite piece was in fact this one. This has an interesting connection with the biennial. It's a 3.5 meter diameter ball. It's a weather balloon on the inside that's covered with black felt on the outside, lovingly stitched by the artist, who's actually German-Dutch, but she was assisting Andries Butcher, who made the little house that you saw at the very beginning at the time. So she helped build that piece because she was his girlfriend at that point. She'd never been to South Africa before. She was just in town visiting and was so traumatized by the theft of these air conditioning units that she never returned to South Africa and refuses to still, because it was awful. It just affected her so deeply, the kind of malicious gesture against art that this kind of expressed. So she created this work, which for her is a work about South Africa. It's a big black hole. It's a blot on her mental landscape that she would never want to revisit. And yet, this ball has become a public, interactive work in so many different cities. Istanbul, tiny towns in the Netherlands, in Germany, I think it's gone to Athens. Picked up all kinds of crap along the way because it's felt, so it just picks up all the dirt. It's disgusting. But packs flat in a suitcase and can just be moved by hand. We got someone just to bring it over in a bag, and you just pump it up with a little air mattress motor, and then basically just gets rolled around. And as soon as you start rolling this thing, it's completely weightless, but it's such an abstraction that people cannot not deal with it. It is there. And yet you can also completely not see it. So you would have people bumping into it because it's black. It just kind of sucks in the light. So you don't even see that it's there until it's there and right in front of you. And we very cleverly planned this performance at peak hour traffic, and in a way instantiated a kind of historical restitution, because Yvonne would not come to South Africa, so we had to do this on her behalf. We took it over that bridge that hadn't existed before to the original site of the biennial, where she would never go again. So if I can bring up that slide. So basically our route, because amazingly the gallery that we were working in is just there. And so we could actually see the original space of the biennial. And we took it over this crazy bridge in peak hour traffic, and picked up all kinds of people along the way that wanted to help. And then just rolled it around in a parking lot for a little while until we got into trouble, because Johannesburg public spaces are heavily monitored, and then got told to leave, and then we rolled it back again in peak hour traffic, blocking all kinds of things. But amazingly, no one got angry. One often hears about road rage in South Africa, but no one shot anyone. They were just shooting with cameras, so lots of cell phones. And then it just hung out outside the gallery for a little while, and that was that. But I think that this black ball is in a way symbolic of so many things. It kind of holds all of this story, in that it is the hole in the map that I started with. It's this mental blockage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and that kind of process of South African history, perhaps even symbolic for Hong Kong in 1997. What is this moment on the landscape in a way that we don't want to remember what we do, and we're desperately trying to reconstitute what happened, what's the change, who are we? But then also this very personal, quite constructive story in that it's this rolling stone that suddenly gathers all this moss. And then what happens to it when suddenly we kind of let it loose down the road. To stop waxing lyrical about that one. But that gets us to the etc. bit. So I'm just going to take you briefly just through a couple contemporary South African projects in a way that are dealing with this rolling stone idea. And then I promise I'll end shortly. This was not actually the title of the last pavilion that South Africa had in Venice, but it was a bit of a gag on that someone came up with on Facebook. In fact, the show was called Imaginary Fact, but someone had fun with this idea of South African contemporary art becoming quite obese on this sense of self and working out our identity, because we've become quite famous for that. South African artists are always dealing with identity because it's such a rich field. We have so much to talk about, and yet we're becoming like the guy from Austin Powers that eats babies. So this was the kind of critique of that exhibition. I'm not going to show you any photographs of it because it makes me angry when I look at it. But it was basically called Imaginary Fact, Contemporary South African Art and the Archive, with a capital A. So the archive is now becoming something very, it's becoming quite a lubricant in a way of a lot of questions and things arising out of identity, but it's a new name that we can kind of give to it. And yet, of course, the urgency of the archive is incredibly imperative, and so I'm not saying that that's not important. It's this, because apartheid itself as a structure relied on the archives so heavily. It was such a heavily paper-worked kind of system where everyone had passes and papers and documents. And where were all those things put? In archives. Things were censored, they were stored in archives. Now what do we do with those things? How do we bring them out? Yes, we watch films like Searching for Sugar Man, where we suddenly see that these things are brought out of the archive. And then we listen to this music again, and it's so wonderful, and it shows us how politically radical we all were, when in fact we weren't. But we can make up these stories about ourselves, and I think that that's really interesting as a moment of reflection within a social process, and that's kind of where we're at. We're kind of getting fat on ourselves, and yet some more perhaps vigorous, less grand gestures are being made across the board by different people. And this is a really wonderful project that was done called 23 kilograms, which is the standard weight allowance of luggage on an international flight, by a curator artist called Bettina Malcolmus, and a number of artists that she brought in with her. I've just chosen two pictures, Francis Berger on the left and Zen Marie on the right. And Zen is also an incredibly focused urban researcher, so that's kind of also his thing, but in this way he was kind of broadening that exploration to the site of The Hague. So they also really chose to kind of look at The Hague as this supposedly very international space, which is in fact so bordered, so shut down, so parochial, actually, on surprise when you arrive on the ground. It's not this kind of diplomatic zone. It's one space within this very small, quite strange little city. And all of them were quite surprised by this, but they were going into the politics of what those expectations mean, that baggage that we bring with us, and also the relations between Holland and South Africa, of course, which go back a long way. But really, again, in a way, starting to think about what are the apparatus that are involved in creating those links. What is the luggage allowance? How many flights per day are there? What are the information politics that traverse between these two places that give us the sense of the other, and how can those be worked through or worked with? And what Zen Marie did was he offered a massage parlor, which he called Massaging Nationalism, and he would talk to you about South African politics while you lay on the chair there, listening to this. He was trained by a Thai masseuse, I think. Anyway, so again, this kind of cultural mashup of things. Perhaps, again, not such a sophisticated project, but an interesting gesture. And Francis Berger was looking particularly at oil scandals surrounding the the 1970s with South Africa's involvement, and all of these kinds of stories that she discovered in the South Africa house in Amsterdam, which no one ever visits, and I didn't even know was there. And this kind of very rigorous research process that goes into that, which doesn't have a necessarily very sexy aesthetic output. As you can see, it's quite a rough, quite basic sort of space, but nonetheless really important that this kind of work is done and these holes are filled, not necessarily by academics who are doing that anyway, but bringing that within a visual realm and making it accessible to a visitor that would just walk into this gallery on their way home and perhaps confront some of these histories that are definitely not part of the main story. Another collective exercise, and I found myself choosing collaborative projects, and I think that that's maybe also telling, is the Bureau du Cinéma Africain. A lot of people would not think of Africa as a major hub of cinematic invention. I think Francophone Africa has a much stronger tradition of cinema than South African, but this duo of artists have kind of taken it on themselves to trace back this history of film within South Africa, but on quite an imaginative sort of level. So their first project actually took an instance of what they posit as the first moment of cinema in South Africa was actually at the end of the 1800s with an illusionist show. This was a real charlatan who posted his tent on the corner of such and such a street and staged a flying woman. But this was done through cinematic devices. And people couldn't believe that she wasn't actually alive, that this was just an image. And it's these kinds of stories, in a way, which are not necessarily politically relevant or concerned with the struggle against apartheid, which is something that's dominated so much of contemporary art in South Africa over the last 20 years. But something different, something kind of pre-apartheid, something post-colonial, but early post-colonial, because this is just in that moment of transition from the English government to the Boers at that juncture of the century. And so that's quite an interesting point, in a way, of that being, in a sense, a similar proximity to where Hong Kong is in relation to the handover. It's not that long afterwards. And so it's grasping for these moments of very close contact, which are just far enough from the true stories to have a little bit of imaginative distance to actually do some work. And to restore a kind of order or instantiate a different kind of question that actually hasn't been asked yet. You might have heard of this group called the Center for Historical Reenactments. I apologize for the bad logo, but that pink elephant is a very symbolic thing in the city of Johannesburg. It's on top of a really famous bottle store, like a liquor store. And they are a group of young art historians, artists and curators who have taken this center around the world, so they kind of set up wherever they're given a space, to inquire after also the kind of micro-histories, the lesser-known or minor histories during apartheid, but also more contemporarily, and looking into personal archives, and then seeking quite different ways of reenacting those things. Again, historical reenactments are these really cheesy moments where people dress, sorry if anyone does them here, I don't mean to insult you, to dress up in military wear of a certain period and go out and fight Gettysburg or do whatever you want. And again, taking that notion of play and of ritualized histories to, again, create a distance, an emotional distance from them and say, but what was really happening here? And how is that story useful to us? What can we make of it in an aesthetic as well as a learning way? What is the knowledge that is produced when we prod it? Again, that question that Inwezer raised. And what if that prodding doesn't produce anything? What are the new intentions that we can generate? What are the other questions we can ask it that will give forth new answers or no answers at all? Maybe an interesting insert is also the world of music is really important within South Africa, and is just, I would say, as creative as the contemporary art field and possibly more radical. Some of you might have heard of DJ Spook Matambo. He's a very young, really interesting guy The shot that I took looks like it was from the early 90s, but in fact it was just made in 2010. And it's called Mshini Wam, which is basically taken from a song that our current president, Jacob Zuma, sings a lot, and it means "get me my machine gun." And this is taken from the resistance and his time as a paramilitary. Very problematic, of course, but Spook Matumbo takes on this history, that history that also he shares as a black male within South Africa, and turns it on its head in a very contemporary sort of way. And I linked it with a work by Brett Murray, which was a big scandal in South Africa in 2012. The Spear was the name of this painting, in which he kind of reinscribed a kind of Leninistic style of depiction of Jacob Zuma, the president himself, featuring his spear for all the world to see, because he has recently been accused on a number of rape charges. So linking, in a sense, this machine gun with the spear and this kind of militaristic legacy that still holds very, very fast within a South African sense of self. And in a way, kind of blowing it out, the whole spear debate really opened up a lot of these issues that in a way the Johannesburg Biennial had also raised of, but what does this mean to us now? Where is the place of art in these sorts of discussions? And what can art do in a way that actually political debate can't? Or what does it open up that in a sense allows us to say the politically incorrect, which governs actually so much of what we do on a daily basis, very politely. I'm looking at the time, it's 9:30, and are you guys really tired of listening to me?
It's 9:10.
Oh, okay. But I do want to leave some time for questions, and I don't want you to get really bored. So we could get to the etc. bit, which is to tell you a little bit about my work as a curator since that project and how I'm kind of framing this issue of the archive. So I'll go, and if I see any yawns, I'll stop. So again, this etc. word being really important, meaning the rest, the things that aren't even worth naming, what gets left out on the margin. It's similar to, but it's not quite the same thing, and it's only used for objects. So et al. Is the correct Latin for people. So where you don't want to name more people in a list of people, you say et al. And then in things, it's etc. So I think that that's kind of important, is that we're talking about objects here. And particularly within the archive, that's a very important sort of question of things that are allowed into it by mistake, and there's a fancy word for that, the columbarium they call it, things that by mishap or chance just find themselves as being really important documents, like the toothbrush of so-and-so that's put in a vitrine because it belonged to whoever. And then you have this etc., the things that are left out that are in fact incredibly important, but aren't brought into those kinds of official structures, and that's actually the part that interests me the most. And as I have apparently become known as the curator that does things with archives, I was approached by a former public art foundation in the Netherlands called SCORE, and they were shut very suddenly because of fiscal cuts at the end of 2011, after 30 years of operating within the Netherlands and the region on these very large-scale public art commissions. And I have a weird history with the Netherlands. I arrived there sort of 5 or 6 years ago and have been going back and forth between there and South Africa since. And so I have quite a distant relationship with that kind of art structure. I've never become very dependent on it, even though up till now it's been incredibly supportive of the arts. But because of a kind of swing to the right, as has happened in a lot of Western Europe, that cultural funding has been cut in the name of the financial crisis, though it's not necessarily true. And as well as a lot of public health care facilities, theatres, music sort of institutions. So it's not only contemporary art that's been targeted, and that's important to say because I know that we like to think that we're very special sometimes. But nonetheless, it was a really big blow, I think, to a lot of artists who were very involved and actually quite dependent on that structure. And yet, because I had that distance, I allowed myself a little bit of room to play. And another organization that's taken over the care of this archive asked me just to do something with it. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked with archives very recently after they have been called archives, but there's a lot of gray around the policy of what can be done with these things, especially when there's a lot of living memory involved and people who are still around that can talk, unlike dead people who can't talk and can't say, no, you're wrong, it wasn't actually like that, it was like this. And in this case, everyone is around and alive and kicking and could have a lot of long conversations with me about how we were misinterpreting certain things. And especially when the hurt is so recent of something being suddenly closed, like the Johannesburg Biennial, one needs to tread very carefully and quite sensitively with this content, but not pussyfoot around it. So how could one do something radical that actually made a comment on where are we going now, that it can't be the same as it was, as in the Johannesburg Biennial, where are we going now, that we can't have this structure anymore, but maybe that's not appropriate. How can we match up the infrastructure with the practice, or push the structure with the practice, and how can we grow these two things together in a different sort of way? And so I arrived at the vitrines and the filing cabinets and the random models of projects that I didn't know if or ever had they been realized, and my first instinct was to put a smoke machine in there. So we got it all nice and cloudy and dramatic, because this is kind of how I felt. It was very foreboding. And this idea of there was an X on the floor, and again, coming back to cartography, X marks the spot, but where were we? It was this black hole. What were we possibly going to do with 30 years of documents that provided any kind of overview or tribute or not tribute to an organization that had been so important to so many people, and still make an interesting exhibition? So basically, I invited a good friend who was also on the Johannesburg show that I did, Antonis Pitos, who's from Greece, and I invited him as the exhibition architect, because he's very interested in exhibition structures, particularly in the Bauhaus period, and how design was working as an art form in itself within those display models. And basically, he proposed to cut up the floor of the exhibition space that we had been given and use that as a kind of mobile display system that different artists that were coming into the space after him could use in different, and use and misuse in different ways, because my rule to them had been no vitrines, no filing cabinets. We are not allowed to have those in the show. It cannot look like an archive exhibition. So everything became much more performative, and it really was about staging the archive. And a kind of phrase that I've carried with me is methodological fetishism. I came across it a little while ago, and it's really thinking fetishistically about what are the modes in which archive purports itself to be: shelves and boxes and files and organization, and how can we use those and misuse those in ways that force us to rethink the apparatus itself, but then also to use it in ways that are convenient for us. So I know that Asia Art Archive just produced their journal, Archive as Method, and I think that that's exactly it. It's how do we think about this conceptually? What is the business of an archive, politically and aesthetically, within it and with its content? So how do we think about the context of the thing as a kind of no zone? Because an archive can be anywhere that it's called an archive. It doesn't matter if it's in one city or another. It's a space that in effect kind of spans the globe, because everywhere has archives. And then how do we think about it? Okay, there's these walls, and what's outside those walls, and then what goes in and what comes out, and how does it do that, and what material forms does it take? And then what are those discussions were it to come out of that door versus that one? And what if we choose not to show, but to insinuate that we are not showing? So what does it mean to conceal, and what does it mean to throw away, that not everything has to be kept? So these are all kinds of questions of like conservation versus curation, and these kinds of frictions that happen as soon as one has to think about making archives public, which bears a lot of responsibility, and particularly here where it was actually quite a political endeavor that we were engaging in. And so as you see, the entrance to the exhibition that Antonis proposed was actually the backstage. So there we showed a kind of loading zone, and therein were kind of the tools that different people could use within the space, that the artists could also prop up a different panel in a different way if they wanted to. They could nail something to a wall, but then we also had actual artworks that were kind of moving in and out of the space, because the space was constantly changing. I didn't want a kind of static, this is the archive show. I asked viewers to come back again and again and again over the 3 months that we were doing it, so that they would see constant iterations or reiterations of what the content of this mammoth thing was that we were never actually going to get on top of. This was one work that one of the artists did in response to a particular project that he found in the archive. It was actually by Art and Language in the early 90s. And that had been done for the European Molecular Biology Lab in Heidelberg. And basically he'd never seen the original work, and so he recreated this triptych of paintings based on the small little book that he had. So you see him referring to it. It's in a little glass case, and he mixed all the oils to exactly the palette that he was looking at within these prints, but of course not true to the things themselves, because of course the print colors could have been completely different by this point. And that in fact there were already 2 versions of the piece existing within the laboratory, because there had been some kerfuffle between the commissioners and the artists, and they'd considered the text that had been added, the language in the Art and Language, to the work to be inappropriate for visitors coming to the lab, because it talked about doubt in science and speculation, that it wasn't all true. So they put the kind of more palatable version in the foyer that Art and Language then produced, and the real one in the laboratory with the scientists that knew, yes, this is actually true, that we're all operating under a cloud of doubt. And James chose to make a kind of remake of the piece with words of Art and Language that he actually asked former employees of this Public Art Foundation to write out like lines, like they were being punished as naughty school children, to repeat these words that Art and Language themselves had written about the age of apocalypse and zombification and things like this. And he put a Dutch flag over it very nationalistically, but also quite teasingly within the end. A piece by Cindy Moorman, where she was looking through the slide library at these kind of monumental shapes and forms that actually bear no relationship to our bodies. We don't even see ourselves connected to these things, especially in the Netherlands, where there's one on every corner. And she basically trained acrobats, but also amateurs, to remake these forms. And it took months of rehearsals to prepare everyone. She chose very primary forms, primary colors also. So we had the pyramid, the cube, the sphere, and the column. And it was all for a 3-minute performance. So like that, it was there and then it was gone. So they would create these shapes, and then they would all just evaporate into the space. And I think in total there were like 100 performers within the space. So in fact, they were the audience as well. So it was kind of playing with this idea of what is public in public art. How can we address that kind of legacy within the space of a closed exhibition? And also, what is the kind of monumentality of the archive itself when these works do exist in real life, but no one notices them anymore, so they might as well be in boxes or behind glass. And yes, we come to the end of that, etc., etc., etc. But yes, so I wanted to kind of posit that as the point, the full stop at which we're at, which is not a full stop, within the research of thinking conceptually about how what I have collected within this archive can be used, also the living memory that exists that still needs to be tapped. So I'm very much only at the starting point of that in relation to the Hong Kong section of the project. But also how can those be performed in different ways? What is the methodology that gets employed? And how can it be made relevant and appropriate to its current context? As a show that was quite unremarkable in the first place, but how, in a sense, could a historical revisitation of it redeem it slightly, or reconcile ourselves with the truths of what was there within that particular moment in history? If there are any questions or comments, or Angie, hello.
Thank you, Claire, for your very passionate lecture, and it's quite remarkable to hear it here. have a question more as a curiosity in relation to the references of the biennial. Yes, it's more like two questions. One is if within the conceptual proposal of the whole exhibition, was there a thinker that Okwi took as being sometimes quoted within the text, or, and that question comes in relation to the other question because I wonder if you've placed in dialogue the Johannesburg Biennial with other large-scale exhibitions that happened in that time. So I'm thinking Catherine David's Documenta and Sao Paulo Biennial, which is also 97, no? The question of the thinkers, because in both Documenta of Catherine and Herkenhoff's Sao Paulo Biennial, for some reason, Lyotard, no? Because of the whole postmodern wave, was constantly quoted, no?
Yeah.
So I wonder if in Johannesburg there was something there.
For sure. I mean, I think I'm also, yes, for the purposes of this presentation, I think I skimmed quite a lot of that kind of initial position around the whole show and what it had represented. And I'm sorry if I, kind of neglected that area. But I think, that's a really important question in terms of how is it conversing with these other moments within that particular period, and also and I would call them like other moments that are not necessarily along the mainstream line. In a way, though, that they are, because of course it was the same art crowd that was attending, probably all of them, in a large percentage, and the same kinds of artists also that were being circulated. Maybe not Johannesburg necessarily, because I know that a large percentage were African that wouldn't necessarily have been involved, and so those interpretations of those questions were probably very different on all of those sides, of course, because again, visa and mobility issues would have. But interesting that the role of theory in a way could traverse those kinds of spaces, and I think Lyotard definitely would have been influential, but I think for Inwezer, I think his line of inquiry seems to be more in keeping with the Homi Bhabhas and this question of culture in quite a poetic sense, but then also Inwezer in his subsequent work has also looked very seriously at the historical, not so much the theoretical aspects of the stories that he's telling. So really looking very specifically at historical moments and naming them and talking about slavery, particularly in relation to trade routes, and about not so much the kind of, so that discursive element is more historically located than philosophically, I would say, in his particular thinking around this show. And yet, of course, it reaches this level of abstraction because it includes so many different perspectives out of these 5 curators that he then involved, that all of them are, again, looking at other references. So you have the Paul Gilroys being brought into that discussion within the catalog, and others. So I think it's really, it's an incredibly broad exercise that he kept open on purpose, I think, because of that. But I think primarily his starting point would have been slavery, and that is the beginning of capitalism. So he's really thinking about those economic lines of connection, and then thinking about what does that mean for us as cosmopolitan. But I'm not so sure that he even uses that word so frequently within that context, and though he has used it a lot later. So I think it's that beginning of that question, and that cosmopolitan bug definitely bit a lot of the subsequent kind of reactions to it and the responses of the artists themselves and the kind of feeling that came out of it. But maybe his question was more historically located, I think, and not so much in South Africa. So that was also the interesting point, was that it was about Africa, and also what it represents as an idea, but not so much about apartheid necessarily, even though that was, of course, bound up into where they were and what they were working through. So that's kind of interesting, the kind of disjunct. But I think a lot of the rhetoric that he uses there can still be seen very much today, and also particularly in his essay, or in that whole compendium that he made, Contemporary African Art since 1989. It's the same kind of voice speaking, which is very interesting. So again, kind of shows maybe the non-pop approach that he's taking, which is also maybe kind of interesting, that he hasn't kind of allowed himself to digress completely, and yet, of course, it's taken him 15 years to create an apartheid show since the biennial, but maybe that was the start of it for him. So it's quite, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question necessarily, but yeah, I guess I'm not sure if he was conversing so much to those other curators on that level through his kinds of choices of thinkers and speakers, but for sure you can see in his selection of the curators themselves, he was very much creating a kind of discussion of his own, I think. But please do read the catalogue, there's some juicy stuff.
May I ask another one? If people want to. No, it's just more on a very personal question on how, I mean, you obviously did not visit the biennial, no? And
I thought contemporary art was
yes.
evil in 1997.
So, how does one, in a very personal sense, become so entitled of something that you romanticize about, no? And I say it in relation to, I don't know, my own research of being fascinated of things that I've never really been there, no?
I think, yeah, I mean, that's a kind of core question, always, of the work of art history. What gives us the right to ever interpret something so out of context as we are? And I guess in the archive as well, to come across a document that you have no right to look at necessarily. And that was actually something that I wanted to bring up, is also the question of Hong Kong and public documents. But anyway, that's another story. But I think for me, that is where this tension of fiction and reality comes in, of allowing myself a certain speculation because it was impossible to relive that moment, because I wasn't there, because I'm not even South African by birth. It was stating that ultimately, of saying this is about if a tree fell in a forest that I didn't hear, and I don't even know if it fell, and I don't even know if that work actually got to Johannesburg. It was telling those stories of the uncertainty of all of this, but through concrete things. So still offering something generous and saying this is a response of something, of someone that claims a kind of connection, and that's okay. Wherein I think the education of art history at the periphery, in any case, is always by distance. And we're writing about frescoes that we've never seen, and we don't even see in color. And so it's a kind of black and white thing that actually prepares you for work in the archive, which is all monochrome and photocopy, and imagining in the color and saying, I think it was kind of like this, and maybe that was the feeling. And of course it completely nullifies that whole question of aura and feeling and experience, because it's completely flattened. So I think that from the first day you're being trained in fictive exercises in a way around all of these stories. And there's a kind of beauty in that. At first I felt very frustrated and felt very isolated, in fact, by all of that. But then suddenly I realized, oh, no, this just means that this is actually the difference. This is doing the thing that actually no one else can do, because you're at that distance. And you have an excuse almost, because you're young, to play that card and say, I wasn't there, I'm sorry. But also at the same time doing it with a kind of modesty, I hope. I don't know if that's always successful, but by including always that intergenerational conversation, so that kind of that working through of personal archives and that consulting with people was really important in the build-up of the research, and to make that kind of public. So through that program, even though again it asks a lot from your viewer, to be part of this kind of guilt assuaging exercise of yours, to say, no, I really am doing my homework, I'm not just being a maverick with this content. But knowing at the end of the day also that you can never fill in all the blanks. So that ... the etc. will always be there. but also not getting nostalgic about the fact that those curators were also claiming an entitlement perhaps to work in Johannesburg that they didn't necessarily have. But that it's always these lapses that did create something interesting and worth talking about that could always have been done better or differently. But that it's that contingency that can always be raised because of that distance, either in time or in background or whatever. So one artist that I invited into the show represented me in a way, because he's my age, and neither of us had any personal experience of the biennial itself. And the work that he made was also very poetic, very small, and kind of still within the whole thing. But for me, it was important to also represent myself by choosing that particular work and saying, we don't necessarily think the same way, but he and I are here putting ourselves within that art historical account as well, and not claiming a kind of puppet master, godlike overview or distance from the event. So it's getting one's hands dirty, I guess, as well, which is sort of the curatorial engagement, I guess. But I don't know if that ever comes across as sincerely as I mean it. I can only hope so. No. How about you? I don't know, how do you feel about that?
No, I wouldn't.
No? dinner conversation.
Dinner, yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I know everybody's probably hungry. I just wanted to comment and play like maybe a little bit of a devil's advocate kind of thing, because it's related to this question that Inti raised, which is really about like your sort of perspective now and being in this place of now and looking back at this kind of a event and this kind of an exhibition and the sort of curatorial framework and strategy. And I mean, I share your views, and sometimes I think we can all be kind of like looking back and have a perception of maybe these, ambitions were so grand and so, sometimes maybe misplaced and unachievable and not really realistic. And in fact, we can see where it, failed and the moments where things didn't, work out. But at the same time, isn't anything really any so different now? I mean, how can, that sort of, view, which I think a lot of us share, is at the same time applicable to almost any kind of event. I mean, what would make that exhibition maybe have a particular, besides it's sort of a colossal sense of like a failure, and that it's like that's sort of documented and evident through that. I'm curious, I guess the question I'm getting at is a little bit has to do like this underlying sense of like there was this raw ambition that they were dealing with. Like where was that really coming from? Because now I think we get cynical towards biennials because we see them as like, okay, they're just celebratory of the city, or there's sort of like a government machine behind this, or there's some agenda that is going on. Like what was there that? What do you think that? Where do you attribute that kind of that sort of ambition? Why they were sort of like reaching so far, but then not able to, get there, or what was the sort of blind spot maybe that, or was there any force behind kind of pushing in any way? Because now I think we attribute this to like the sort of the funding sources, right, behind these events. So in that case, was there any? I'm just curious to see how you view that.
No, I think that's a really important question. It's in this case it is interesting because it's municipal funding, so it's public money coming from Johannesburg. So it's not even like a bigger fish that's trying to like push some agenda within the space, which of course then gets shut down by that political imperative of just being like, oh, we can't actually afford to run you any longer. And their true colors were shown in that as soon as their greater commitment to that contemporary art ambition was out of sync with what that actual ambition was, it was closed. And it was kind of like, I'm sorry, we're just pulling the plug. And it was that kind of discussion of just like, oh shit, we didn't realize what we committed to. And so I think it's definitely not on that level, that it's actually still very modest in scale when one thinks about what it was actually achieving within the parameters that were set for it. I think for me, because I'm digging into it as a curator, I'm looking at that curatorial ambition in relation to a very difficult set of circumstances that there seems to be, from the documentation, quite a lack of reflection on the appropriateness of what that scale meant within that time and place, and that it seemed to be quite an egotistical exercise within establishing a discourse that was different from these other big biennials. It was challenging those structures, reinventing that structure on a city level and really calling it the Johannesburg Biennial, so it wasn't about South Africa. And beginning that tradition, or not beginning it, but sort of becoming part of the founding of that tradition of city biennials and this kind of site-specific response to a place. And so for me, I guess because I'm so mired in the research and I feel like I know all these people quite well now, it's possible that I sound quite cynical when I hold them up, and I certainly don't mean to make a joke of it. So that's certainly not, like when I laugh about it, it's only because I'm laughing because I'm completely complicit within that same process of wanting to do something radical, and then at the end of the day being like, but why did you really want to? Because you would be doing something radical. So that is always the kind of the criticality that I have to be faced with eventually. And also, again, that very exercise of looking back, you're the one claiming and looking back, so that this becomes Claire's revisitation of the biennial. So I think it's that's certainly something that I would like to avoid, but is probably a symptom of just the fact that you pick something up because you find it interesting and then you run with it for long enough, which is possibly also how they felt at the beginning of being invited into something that was interesting, and they ran with it and didn't really think necessarily of how that would come out. But it's the articulation of those ambitions which I just find unreflexive. And that's literally, it's as small a point as that, but if there was at least one self-effacing remark, or kind of like, oh, well, yes, I think it could have worked better in this way, or the kind of communication with the artists, or the respect with which they were dealt with, that would show me that there was something different, or there was an attempt within that structure to also critically engage with the structures of biennial itself, not only on the nationalistic level, but also like, how do we work together in a difficult environment like this? It's actually through cooperation. It can't be the same as in another kind of place because the resources just aren't there. So it's based up of a number of accounts, I think, of just talking to people and how they dealt with these hotshot artists versus how South African artists were dealt with. And it's all of those kinds of politics that make me think it's an incredibly interesting example, and certainly not the only example, but again, by virtue of just making it your study, you're bordering it and saying, I'm calling this something special because I'm focusing on it. But it's also, by looking back at it, I'm also hoping to make those connections with maybe things haven't changed that much. But how can the re-looking, and this is why we always look at history, is how can we reflect on ourselves differently and say, where are we at? And so I think that's the importance of recouping it. It's not to say, they did it wrong, because I think that was the many challenges were very evident at the time, but to say, what did they do right, and how was this interesting, and how can we re-articulate that productively within the present? So not to repeat those errors, or to romanticize the triumphs, but to say, what was really going on, how was that structure working, what were the artworks that were involved, how can we do credit to those artists that weren't necessarily made visible within the history of the biennial, because the biennial was such a heavy structure that it seems like a lot of the artworks just kind of got lost. So how can we recoup those smaller stories within the big narrative, and then actually draw something interesting out of that in relation to where we are now? And again, that someone else could do it differently in a few years' time, and I hope they will. So again, it's just to kind of raise it above the surface of the sea and just say, let's look at this again. And then how can the beginning of that discussion then lead to others? Hopefully not another Johannesburg Biennial, but a kind of critical engagement with the what if question. Yeah.
May I add something quick? Very quick, but it's
Sorry.
well, no, just to add that I would disagree to think that it's similar to whatever is happening here, because I think that one of the very interesting remarks that you placed at the beginning was that indeed 1997 or things that were happening at that time were the landmark of many things of how we conceive the present, you know? So you even related on this new trade routes within the contemporary art system, you know? What happens in 1997 in Johannesburg is that there's an international scale, not saying in the local meaning of what biennial meant, but in the large-scale exhibition history, it did wanted to create a kind of internationalism that this heavy and canonical biennials like Venice Biennial were not allowed, you know? So to have a curator from Cuba, from Spain, from Korea, and from China was actually 1997 something very odd, you know? Today, this is basically the system that we have, no? Which is this reconciliatory art system, no? But I think that what's still nostalgic, or how I found it, and maybe you also find it nostalgic on how they were dealing with it, was that there was a lot of political commitment to the context, while our today global system seems quite apolitical in a sense. So yeah. First of all, I wouldn't think that it's clearly not the same system. And second, I would never call it a failure because we're speaking about it still.
Exactly.
So it might be a failure in whatever local terms or within the relationship of artists with the event, but as what it meant for contemporary art history, it's not a failure because again, we're here in Hong Kong talking about it. Like, why would we talk about not the first night or not that?
Or that failures can be monumental. And we need to rethink what we mean by that word and why is a failure not worth discussing in productive terms. So it's, and I would agree, I wouldn't call it an entire failure either. And I think it's, it did many wonderful things. But again, to kind of recoup this idea of the mistake or the fallout or the catastrophe, that actually those are usually the things that punctuate history. Exactly. Keep it going.
Thank you.